We have more than 130 people who have registered for this training, certainly demonstrating the broad demand for and the interest. I'm happy to once again be working with our partners at the National League of Cities. This is the third training offered to AWC member cities and towns in partnership with the NLC Rio. And we are committed to providing our members with ongoing training to strengthen local government officials' knowledge, capacity to eliminate racial disparities and build more equitable communities. AWC's mission is to serve our members through advocacy, education, and services. And we know that supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives is important in everything that we do. In 2019, the AWC Board of Directors adopted a new strategic plan with a commitment to review our programs and services to ensure equitable access by members. To examine our programs and services, the AWC Board created an equity work group, members of which are on this training and kicking off their work today. Before we begin, I want to remind all attendees that this is a two-part series, with the second session taking place on Wednesday, September 16. Today's session will wrap up at 11:30 a.m., sooner than we advertised. The training is being recorded and we encourage everyone to participate with their camera on. Lastly, I want to remember the members of the AWC Equity Work Group to remain on this webinar after the training ends for a separate session. And with that, I will introduce our speaker, Leon Andrews. He's NLC's Director of Race, Equity, and Leadership. So welcome and thank you, Leon.
Great, thank you, Alicia. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Thumbs up?
Yep.
Good, excellent. Thank you for that introduction. It's good to see everyone. I'm going to share my screen so you guys could also walk with me through the presentation. All right. Just checking. Can you guys see the screen?
I can.
Awesome. Great. You have to love technology. This is fantastic. All right. So again, I'm Leon Andrews with the National League of Cities. I lead our REAL department, which stands for Race, Equity, and Leadership. It's great to be back engaged, connected with so many of you. We've been partnering with the Association Washington Cities over the last year, and really appreciate their commitment to this work and partnering with them as U.S. city leaders are really trying to find your space and your role of leadership. And so we're glad that this is the start of a series of conversations and dialogue with you. In that space, I'd like to start by really naming the moment that we're in. I want to play a very short video that for me I thought really brings into the room kind of the moment.
I can't breathe shit. Why is a black life any more recoupable than a white?
Let it be known wherever we go that all of us should be free and equal and have all opportunities that others should have.
I am the people. I'm not the pig. You got to make a distinction. And the people are going to have to attack the pig. The people are going to have to stand up against the pig.
So the only way we're going to get some of this oppression and exploitation away from us or aside from us is come together against the common enemy.
Being shot, being killed by the NYPD.
for having black people and people of color who absolutely abused and killed and it's getting worse and worse. We've had enough, and if they're not going to listen, we're going to scream louder and louder, and we're not going to stop until something is done. We've had enough. This is people who have had enough. It's time to make some change.
So that clip for me in 3.5 minutes kind of brings for me into the room kind of what we've all been seeing almost for the last 3 months. The protests and the uprisings have really elevated the racial tension that we're seeing in our cities across the state of Washington, across our country. The rising tensions are real, and we also know we're in a moment of what leadership looks like. And so in that space, I thought this quote from the late Dr. Maya Angelou really for me speaks to the moment. For us as city leaders, as you think about this moment, sitting with this quote, "Prejudice is a burden that confuses the past, threatens the future, and renders the present inaccessible." What really speaks to me when I see this quote is acknowledges our inability as city leaders to be able to not just talk about this, but to be able to lead, to be explicit about what leadership needs in this moment. We'll only find ourselves coming back to this issue 5, 10, 50 years from now. And so what does it look like to lead in this space as you're committing as city leaders to do more than just prevent further conflict, right? And the reason why I say more than preventing further conflict is because I think about the journey NLC has been on for the last almost 6 years. When REAL was created, it was created with the backdrop of Ferguson. Ferguson, where we all remember the killing of Michael Brown and the protests that happened that followed Ferguson that got so much attention 6 years ago. It caught a lot of city leaders by surprise that moment. And so when we were engaging with Ferguson 6 years ago, they're a member of the National League of Cities. They reached out to us and they were looking for some guidance. NLC hadn't created REAL yet. In fact, we were not even in the space where we were doing anything explicitly in the racial equity or racial justice space. And so when we were engaging with Ferguson, we obviously said, don't do what you're doing, tanks on the streets, not a good idea, but didn't have any more than that at that point. What was the guidance that we could offer city leaders? And that was 6 years ago. And many times 6 years ago, a lot of what we were hearing from cities is help us not become a Ferguson. And that's very different than the conversations we're having right now with the city leaders. It's more than that, not help us prevent it from happening, but how do we lead in this space? What's our role as city leaders to really engage in this space? And so REAL was created with that as a backdrop of how do we help you as city leaders to strengthen your knowledge, your capacity in your role in eliminating racial disparities, healing racial tensions, and building more equitable communities. And so on that journey for the last 6 years, there's a number of things that we've done, provide training and technical assistance, as you're getting a version of that with, as we're all now in this virtual space, learning how to do it virtually. But we also provide a range of technical assistance to cities, create a lot of networking for city leaders to learn from each other, as well as making a lot of connections to special populations work, realizing that this work doesn't just sit in a bubble, but how do you connect our boys and men of color work to these issues? How do we connect our religiously persecuted? How do we connect our LGBTQ centering racial equity to our indigenous population, or even our women and girls? So there's a lot of special population connections to this work. And so in the last 6 years, we're going on 6 years now, our network has grown in terms of the training, the technical assistance, the number of cities and city leaders that we're working with, very different than where we were 6 years ago. And so the map gives you a sense of that. You can see where Washington is. There's been some work we've done with of city leaders that have been very engaged in our work through training and technical assistance. But literally across the country, over 400 cities and over 700 city leaders across this country. And so while the map gives you a sense of kind of the foundation that's been laid of city leaders that are engaged in this space, I also want to be very clear that it doesn't mean that these are places where that cities have figured it out, where these are places where they have eliminated racism or structural racism. So it's by no means are we coming before you suggesting that there is a map to how you solve it, or follow X city and you'll figure it out. Everyone is on a journey, and I really want to acknowledge that. There's a lot of great work that Seattle has done. There's a lot of great work that Boston has done, a lot of great work that St. Louis Park, Minnesota has done, but none of those cities would say that they have figured out a way to end racism, right? And so I want to just acknowledge that. There's a journey that you're on, but what it does provide is a foundation for building. And that has been the space that we've been excited about in this moment, about how do we use this as an opportunity to build on that foundation, and what's the next part of that journey as city leaders are committed to doing this work. And so as we've been on that journey, it's also been important for us not to reinvent the wheel. So we've had a lot of good partners in our space when REAL was created. Want to acknowledge our formal partnership we have with Race Forward, the Center for Social Inclusion, that's also partnered with GARE, which has served as a helpful foundation for the work that our team has done and the work that we do with cities. And the reason why I acknowledge that, because the framework that we use has been connected to our partners. We now have modified it in the work that we do for city leaders, but we've been very intentional about not reinventing the wheel. And so this framework is really what I want to introduce at the time that we have together, where we're spend a little bit of time in the normalizing space, spend some time in operationalizing and organizing. The normalizing, particularly for the time that we're together, for this first session, is going to be super critical just to lay the foundation. Like, what do we mean as we start talking about racial equity? Everyone has different starting points in this space. And so we realize it's important to create the space of normalizing. Before you start thinking about tools and resources and data and how do you start to get organized within this work. All three are needed, but we're going to spend most of our time today in the normalizing space. But what I do want to also just make sure I'm flagging as you're thinking about this work is, as you're understanding some of this, depending on where your starting point is, think about how this could work in your own city. Thinking about the journey that not just you, your colleagues on council, people within your community, everyone is on different journeys. And when you're thinking about normalizing is a space that you need to be committed to across the entire work you're doing within your city. And so I want to start with normalizing. Kind of our first part of normalizing is, why are we leading when we do this work, leading with race? And that's a really important space to really acknowledge. When we launched REAL 6 years ago, we had our first REAL talk. It was in DC in March. We had about 400 elected officials that were in the room, and the conversation was very intentional, because when we created REAL, it was race, equity, and leadership. So we were acknowledging the need to call out race, but also wanting to really look at a range of equity issues. And so we wanted to have that first REAL talk, and everyone it was a mess. People were talking about everything and nothing all at the same time. And so we found ourselves having to do a reset and acknowledging, like, we needed to be more thoughtful about how we were going to engage city leaders in this space. And so we started to engage a number of experts in the field that helped us understand particularly the data. And the data was really compelling. As we started to look at the data and those that are in that space, the data continued to reinforce, whether we were talking about infant mortality to life expectancy, race is still the strongest predictor of one's success in this country. So we have to, in doing this work, from a city's perspective, understand, why are we leading with race? The data takes us there. And so unpacking that is important, right? And I want to unpack some of that in kind of our first normalizing. Making that statement is an important communication talking point for if you're in the space of people. Why are we talking about race? Why not poverty? Why not income? Why not health? Right? And so it's race is the strongest predictor when we control for everything else. And here's an example of a study that was done by the Center for Disease Control, looking at maternal mortality rates of women. And so they did exactly that. They controlled for everything in a woman's background. They controlled for how much money she made. They controlled for her educational background, what her educational status was. control for where she lived within the country. And after controlling for all of that, still found that Black women had 2 to 3 times higher rates of maternal mortality, controlling for everything else in a woman's background. Right? Again, reinforcing that message that even if we're not just looking at health, if we were looking at our educational system, if we were looking at our criminal justice system, if we're looking at unemployment and workforce, look at right now all the attention that has been garnered around the coronavirus and the disparities that we're seeing from the data, the disproportionate number of Black and Latinx communities that are dying, with the unemployment rates that have been spiking, the disproportionate number of Black and Indigenous that are and Latinx communities that are have a higher rates of unemployment. So the consistency of the data has always been there even before coronavirus. If we know the data is taking us there, then the work is, what do we do if we're going to be committed to advancing racial equity, where we know that race is still the strongest predictor of one's success? And so it's really in that space, I want to really name what racial equity is. If we know that race is the strongest predictor, racial equity is closing the gaps where race no longer predicts one's success while improving outcomes for everyone. So both are important, right? And to be able to do this work, we don't want to see race being the strongest predictor of one's success. And so our racial equity work is closing the gaps where race is no longer predicting one's success while improving outcomes for everyone. Both are important, right, in the definition of advancing racial equity. And so to be able to do that, we need to be targeted. We need to be targeted in our strategies. There's a term that Dr. John Powell has put out. He used to be with the Kirwan Institute at Ohio State. He's now at Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, with the Othering and Belonging Institute. He's a term called targeted universalism. Targeted universalism, which is how are we targeted in our process, but universal in our goals. Targeted universalism. And that is what drives racial equity. If we know from the data, race is the strongest predictor of one's success, our work is closing the gaps where race is no longer predicting one's success while improving outcomes for everyone, and us being intentional about being targeted, getting to the root causes, going beyond just looking at services and programs, really trying to understand why is it that race is still the strongest predictor of one's success, for as we're looking, for instance, at the maternal mortality rates. After controlling for everything else in a woman's background, still finding that Black women have 2 to 3 times higher rates of maternal mortality. And how do we then be targeted in our strategies and in our process, right? And so that was really critical for us as we got started with naming racial equity, understanding why we were leading with race. And so we had one of our first real talks in DC 5 years ago. It was at the museum. It was a panel discussion. Clarence Anthony, our CEO, was moderating it. In the middle was our two past presidents, Councilmember Matt Zone from Cleveland, Ohio, and former mayor from Gary, Indiana, Karen Freeman Wilson. And then to the right is Tim Wise, who's one of our real board of advisors. And so I wanted to play this short clip of that dialogue that we had. It was the opening conversation to a 90-minute dialogue that really named a lot of the framing that really went into the work that we're doing in normalizing. So I'll play the clip.
Tim, you have written a book about this subject from a different perspective. What are your thoughts, opening thoughts about where we are in America right now?
Well, in the 3 minutes, 3 to 5 that we've been given, I'll do my best to answer it. And I know we're going to get deeper into this conversation as we go, so I'll save some of what I want to talk about for that. But I really appreciate the way that you framed the discussion at the outset, because at least on 2 occasions I heard you reference something that we really don't do very much in this country, and that is you referenced systemic racism, and you referred to it in that way. And I think that's important. In fact, it's critical, not just for the National League of Cities effort, but for our conversation as a country, because too often what we do, and I think we all know this, is we look at racism as that thing that happened in Charleston. That is to say, and when I say that thing that happened, I'm not talking about the generations of institutional racism. I'm talking about the thing that happened this summer. We look at that as racism. We say, well, Dylan Roof walks into a church and massacres 9 people. and the city comes together and the state comes together and the country grieves, and that's racism. And so, and then we sort of wash our hands of it because we say, well, thankfully that doesn't happen every week. That doesn't happen all the time. That's an anomaly. But we have to be prepared to look at racism as something that's far deeper than that, and not about bigotry, not about overt hatred, and not just about that type of random retail violence, because that's retail violence. We've got wholesale violence. And by that, I mean, if you're going to understand what happened in Baltimore in the last 6 months, you cannot start with Freddie Gray, and you cannot start even with the police department in Baltimore. You have to start with the fact that that is a community that was wrecked by so-called urban renewal. That was violence. When they come in and they put the interstate through your community and they knock down your business and they knock down your apartments and they make folks huddle into small crowded housing and they essentially lock them in a holding pen. I mean, we talk about housing and education. We talk about neighborhoods as if it's not about racism. We act like folks just ended up where they ended up. But let's be clear, this thing that we in this country call the ghetto, that was created. And it wasn't created by black people, and it wasn't created by poor people. It was created by folks who were usually not black and definitely not poor as a holding pen for the people they didn't want to live amongst them. So we have to be prepared to call that violence. If you don't call zoning laws and redlining violence, even though it does violence, and you don't call it racism, then how are we going to solve that? So I want us to frame this conversation the way that you've done it. And I think that's where we are as a country. We're still stuck in this mode of describing racism as this interpersonal thing rather than understanding it structurally and institutionally. And I think until we get to that place where we can talk about not just that individual cop who does something wrong in the community, which we can see plenty of examples of that, but until we deal with the mentality that says that spatial isolation, segregation, residential isolation, black and brown kids going to schools 12 times more likely to be places of concentrated poverty. That's not an accident. People didn't choose that. And so I think that's where we need to go, is to frame the conversation in a way that reminds us that we're talking about systemic and structural violence. And we can't just talk about the sort of retail level stuff, as important as that is, and as horrific as a hate crime is. You know, to be really honest, at the risk of being hyperbolic, aspects of this country's history have been an intergenerational hate crime against certain people. And that's just the truth. We don't like to use language like that. You know, sounds un-American, unpatriotic, whatever kind of terminology we use, but that's real. And unless we're prepared to do it that way and have that conversation that way, I'm afraid we'll keep spinning our wheels, coming back, having the same conversations over and over and over again. The reason that low-income black folks were the ones hit hardest in New Orleans was not an accident. And what was stunning to me about it, and I lived there for 10 years, the only people that were shocked by what happened, for the most part, were white folks. Black folks weren't shocked that they got uprooted. They weren't shocked that they got left behind and forgotten. That was the history of that community, right? Urban renewal did that. Interstate highway construction right through the Treme, the oldest free black neighborhood in this country, did that. And so it was just same thing, different day. A little bit more extreme, and the cameras were on. And, you know, they made movies about it. But it was the same stuff that had always been happening. So we have to go back to that systemic understanding, which is something I think the movement historically knew, but most of our leaders have sometimes forgotten.
Wow. So we're going to have a real conversation today, aren't we? I think I'm ready. I think I'm ready.
And so, to be honest, Clarence was not ready for that conversation 5 years ago when we had that first real talk. Anyone who knows Clarence knows that he rarely is speechless. So that's a great face for Clarence, where he had nothing really to say in that moment. Because what Tim just said in 3.5 minutes, it was very uncomfortable for me at that time. I mean, there was a lot of, ouch, okay, are we going here? And how do we help city leaders understand what he just said in 3.5 minutes? And so the reason why I bring it into the room is because part of what we want to be able to do is really take you on some of that journey to understand everything Tim Wise just said in 3.5 minutes. Like, what is it grounded in? There's lots of terminology in there. And this is a more condensed training because we obviously would spend a little more time unpacking a lot of it, but I want to spend some time in kind of this part 2 of our normalizing, unpacking some of the terminology that you heard in what Tim Wise just said, and acknowledging each of you are a different starting point. So if there are places, there's no assumption here that as we are sharing things that you should know anything that there's a starting point that you should come in already knowing some of this. So if there are questions that you have, feel free, because there will be opportunities for you to be able to ask some questions at the end, or even if there is a chat feature, and we all also are monitoring the chat feature too. And if there are some particular questions that you have as I'm making some points, please flag that for me. Again, I do not want to assume here that everyone is processing this and in a space that you, and I'm not making any assumptions that you should know things that I'm saying as I'm presenting it to you. So that my goal here is really providing some foundational information to lay a foundation for really building on it with our partnership with you. And so in that space, one of the places we do want to name, really important in just understanding language, is the differences between equality and equity. And it's a word, particularly when we do our Real 101 trainings, it's really important to recognize that these are two separate words.
Leon?
Yeah, go ahead.
Ty Stober here. Hey, this meeting is overwhelming the circuitry, so it's coming through very unclearly. So you're going to have to describe your slides a lot more than what you normally would have to. Thank you.
Thank you, Ty. That's helpful to hear. Good feedback. Are you just in that same space of describing more? Are you guys seeing the image at all, or is
we can see, and I can read equality, but I can read nothing underneath it.
Got it. Thank you. That's good, helpful feedback. Right. So thank you. That's the kind of feedback in a virtual space. Feel free at any time to. That's exactly what Ty just modeled. Everyone, please model in some place, and we'll manage. If this is not landing with you, please let us know. And so this slide is intended to kind of show the differences between equality and equity. 3 people, as you can see, for those in the image, 3 people trying to watch the game from behind the fence, and equality is giving them the same thing. You give them a box for them to be able to watch the game from behind the fence. The same thing. Equity is asking, what do they need? If the goal is for them to watch the game from behind the fence, the person on the left does not need anything to watch the game from behind the fence. The person in the middle needs 2 boxes, and the person on the right needs a ramp. And so it's important to, at a very high level, recognize that hopefully what this diagram does, it helps you see very quickly the differences between the words. Equality meaning sameness, equity meaning fairness or justice. What does someone need as you're talking about them watching the game from behind the fence? And the reason why we start here is because it's important to get equity and equality differences at the high level. So if you walk away, one takeaway is, oh, these are 2 separate words, and you remember this diagram, that's awesome, right? But it's also important to recognize that equity is much more nuanced than this. Right, and so this slide is intended to be simple, right, for you to quickly understand the differences between equity and equality. But we also want you visually to realize that there are lots of other questions you could be asking if you really are digging deeper into understanding equity, right? And so in this slide, just using the same kind of concept of them trying to watch a game from behind the fence, there could be questions that you're not asking about. Are they starting on the same? Is the ground even? Right? Do they have different starting points? There could be questions you could be asking about the fence. Is the fence designed where it's fair for them to be able to watch the game from behind the fence? And to be honest, you can go even further. Like, you could start asking the question, do we have the right goals? Why are they watching the game from behind the fence? How come they're not watching the game in the stands? How come they're not playing in the game? How come they don't own the team? Right? You can start asking a whole lot of other questions as you really are trying to understand equity, right? So by no means are we suggesting equity is a simple process, but we do want at a very starting point to recognize the differences between equity and equality in our starting point, that you're not using those words interchangeably, that you walk away with a clearer understanding of the differences between the two. All right, so that, for me, equity versus equality was kind of step 1, just making sure that as a group, you guys are processing that. Another part of normalizing that we want to do in this space with you is talking about bias as you center racial equity in the work. It's important to understand bias, understand bias as you think about racial equity. So bias, as you hear the term, we all use it, in different ways. When we talk about bias from a definitional standpoint, we're talking about how we evaluate and make associations of one group and its members relative to another. Like it's these associations we're making and evaluations we're making about groups. Right, and I want to just at the outset acknowledge we all do it. Our brains do it without even thinking we do it. It's an inescapable reality of who we are as beings. And so to acknowledge that we do it, many times we do it in this space not unaware. It's the reason why it's important to bring it up as we talk about racial equity is it's about how our bias impacts our choices, how it influences our actions, particularly when those actions can lead to being negative or discriminatory, right? And so we want you to be able to understand that and sit with that as you particularly understand how this is impacting us in an implicit way. So there's everyone as city leaders are probably implicit bias training. Everyone has heard some version of that, right? And so what is, when we talk about implicit bias training, right? It's an acknowledgement of spaces of where we operate unconsciously, the unaware places of how we're evaluating and associating one group as it relates to another. And it's really in that space that we want to kind of acknowledge and unpack that a little bit. And so when you hear implicit bias, another term that you also hear that's connected to implicit bias is kind of the unconscious space, the unconscious mind. It's like the information that we're processing when you hear that is in the brain science research, the language that they use talks about how our brains organize things into schemas, where these are these frames that we quickly create, where our brain tries to understand and navigates the world. It's how we shape our environment, right? We quickly make these associations, sort things into categories, try to quickly fill in the gaps, right? And one example that that helps me kind of illustrate that is my last time that I was in New Orleans. I had what was it? It was alligator. I had alligator for the first time, and I said, "Oh man, this thing tastes just like." Put it right into my chicken category, right? So we all do those quick associations, right? Without this unconscious, our brains do it. It's just kind of who we are, right? And so there's a lot we could unpack in a training, and we tend to do in a more in-person training where we kind of help unpack that for you to realize how our brains process that. But the reason why we bring it up in the context of understanding racial equity is realizing that particularly as we start to make those associations based upon our exposure to race. And there's a lot of our exposure to race that has happened in our unconscious space. It's the environments that we've grown up in. It's the neighborhoods. It's our faith. It's our fraternities. It's the part of the country that you're in. It's the media that we've been exposed to. There are lots of things that are happening that are feeding into our unconscious space, that when we get exposed and socialized to that group based upon that, we then start to make automatic unconscious associations of the identity with that characteristic of the person. And that's really important when we start to think about where that exposure has played out and what we know from the research of that strong implicit association that exists between African Americans and criminal activity. And so we know that from the research. There's a lot in that unconscious space where that association is happening. And our brains are taking it in and not even realizing it's taking it. And that's across the board. That's everyone to a person. Right? And so it's really important to acknowledge that, which is why it's important as we talk about it's centering that in how we understand racial equity. And so it's within that, I want to bring some of that into the room, right? So I want to play this short clip. Hopefully you can see it. That really pay attention. There's not going to be any words, but it will be more of a visual for you to be able to see. What I liked about that very short clip that was put together by our partners at Procter and Gamble was really creating a space for a discussion about the look, right? And obviously our hope is where we're able to spend a little bit more time, less than a 2-hour training here. We want to have a conversation about that. Each of you were processing aspects of that video, like what was the look? There were lots of looks going on there, right? And it's really important as you center that look in the context of understanding bias. What's informing people's mindsets as they are consciously or unconsciously reacting in that look, right? And there's a lot to kind of take in that space. And I also bring it up too, because while I started off showing the video of everything that's been happening in the last couple of months, from George Floyd to Breonna Taylor to Ahmaud Arbery, and a lot of the tension that is happening, racial tension in our cities and the protests and the uprisings, there was a video that was also came out right around that same time that many of you may have seen with Amy Cooper. She was in New York City, the Central Park area, and there was she was a white woman, and then there was a black man. His name was Chris Cooper, who was bird watching, and there was a video exchange between Amy and Chris. Y'all remember seeing that video? Folks remember seeing that video? Yeah, I see some nodding heads, right? So that for me was another very powerful moment, not really to talk about that exchange, like what was in that exchange, what was centering where Amy was coming from, as we talk about bias and kind of her own privilege space that she was in, white privilege space that she was in, as we talk about how that shows up as we do this work in centering equity. And the reason why I feel is also important to name in context of also everything that we're seeing with from the earlier video with George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, et cetera, is to recognize the layers of how bias shows up, particularly as you start to center racial equity. And so here was kind of and so this slide here really begins to talk about the layers of bias as we start talking about equity, right? There's understanding bias implicitly, explicitly at the individual level, and it's also understanding bias implicitly and explicitly at the institutional level. And both are going to be so important for you as city leaders in how you have a plan for all of this, right? And understanding how it shows up, and examples of how it shows up, and strategies you have for really responding. And some strategies are already available to you because of policies that are already in place. But this was an exercise we did with that the police department did. It actually wasn't the state of Washington. It was a city in the state of Washington, a police department that actually went through this training. They tried to identify some specific examples of where bias does show up at each of the different levels. And so as they talked about the individual bias, the individual example of individual implicit bias, the example they came up with was police officers calling for backup more often when stopping a person of color. So this individual implicit is the unconscious attitudes and beliefs of the officer. Why is it that they are calling for backup more when they're stopping people of color? Now, we had a very lengthy conversation of, is that all implicit? Is that some of that explicit in some of their behaviors? But it could be in the unconscious space where it's happening. Right, and so how is that playing, as an example, how does that play itself out, and what are some actions and strategies that you would take in that space, knowing that, there's a pattern there. The individual explicit that the officers came up with here was a police officer calling someone an ethnic slur while arresting them. Clear examples, most of our radars are up on that. As city leaders, you kind of know when you see the explicit behavior, right? And so there's particular action and recourse if the individual officer is doing that, caught on tape, et cetera. There are ways that you can kind of have disciplinary actions that are associated with that, right? And the same is true for institutional explicit, right? If we look at policies that explicitly discriminate against a group, which is a police department, in this example, refusing to hire people of color, right? That's a clearly institutional explicit action. And we have policies in place where those are now illegal. It's unlawful to be able to take a position like that because of the laws that we've put in place. 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law, right? There are things that we have put in place that have and provide recourse. But a lot of the work is really, it falls in that institutional implicit work, particularly you as city leaders. These are policies that negatively impact one group unintentionally, right? It's nothing in the policy that explicitly says that it will impact one group unintentionally, but it is having that impact. And how do you then do the work to really understand that those policies are having that impact unintentionally to a particular group, right? And so the example that the police department gave here was focusing on street level drug arrests. And that might be intuitive to you, but we had a very long, lengthy conversation about, well, why is that institutional implicit, right? And so as you think about a city's commitment to, let's say, fighting drugs, war on drugs, and you want to kind of address the disproportionate use of drugs within your city, and you want to be more targeted about addressing that issue within your city. If you focus on street level drug arrests, what would be the outcome that you would expect? Well, let me ask a couple questions. When you think about drug use, who use, and just by show of hands for those I see on video, who tends to use drugs more, white people or people of color? Let me see a hands for white people. Let me see hands for people of color. Let me see hands for about the same. All right, so it's about the same. All right, so that was a trick question. And so white people, nationally, this is not in the state of Washington, but across national data across the country, white people and people of color tend to use drugs about the same. All right, well, let me ask a second question. Again, just by a show of hands, who tends to distribute drugs more? Drug distributors. How many folks say white people tend to distribute drugs more? How many folks say people of color tend to say drugs more? How many folks say it's about the same? All right, so it's not really about the same. It actually leans a little more white people nationally. So white people, it's in the 50%, tend to distribute drugs more than people of color, right? Now, the third question I have is where do you think from the research white people tend to distribute and use drugs more? In public settings or in private settings? Private settings, right? Hands for private settings, right? And so it's usually in social settings. It's at their house, at a party, right? And so that's where they would tend to, what the research shows, where white people tend to use drugs more. And then what we also find is where do we know people of color tend to distribute or use drugs more? In more public settings, right? And so if you have a policy that says we want to tackle drugs in our city, and we're going to be targeted, having a targeted street level drug arrest, what will the outcome be? Did nothing in your policy say that you intend to want to arrest more people of color? But because you unpack the data and start asking yourself certain kinds of questions, that will be the outcome, right? And so that's a very high level example of being able to begin to ask yourselves those questions that allow you to be able to realize the disproportionate impact, the unintentional impact your policies have. So I hope that makes sense. We tend to, if we have a more deep, longer time in exercise, we actually want to spend more time here with you in this space, because that example is, shows up in so many different places as we start to think about our policies, practices, and procedures. But the reason why we spend a little bit of time naming it and really, again, spending time in the normalizing space talking about bias is how important it is to think about those different levels of bias and how it shows up as you are centering equity. And acknowledging it, the work is not suppressing. It's saying as city leaders, oh, we don't have bias in our city, or why we don't have it at the individual or institutional level. Not suppressing it is the wrong strategy, right? Because all it will do will only increase the prejudice rather than eradicate it. So you got to be willing to think about, what do we need to do as a city to be accountable, to take action, right? If we're committed to really centering racial equity in this work, right? And so that's the reason why in our in what is our Normalizing 101, we want to bring that into the room to name it. That's a really important part of your work, really, as you start to understand that part of the normalizing. And so, so I spent some time on bias, helping you understand some of that, spend some time, helping you understand the differences between equity and equality. And all of that was, we haven't even yet talked about racism, right? And so it's a term that we've been, that we hear and we use a lot. And where does that fit? What is racism in this space as we talk about racism, right? And so want to be able to name, as we talk about racism, the different levels. Now, and really acknowledging while there are different levels of racism, they're all connected. So, but it's important for us to be able to at least name, as you've heard, individual racism, you've heard institutional racism, you've heard structural racism, you've heard systemic racism. This is language that people are using, and what does it mean, right? And so this is really important in the space of normalizing, right? And so at the individual racism level, it are the individual acts of bias and discrimination, right? And that's the Dylan Roos, as you heard from Tim Wise in that video, right? It's the Charlottesville a couple of years ago, right? It's the individual acts of racism, right? And so that's a space that most people process. They're looking for those individual acts of racism. The other two are really important to sit with because it speaks a lot more to you as city leaders or even helping your communities understand it as you think about policy, your practices and procedures, right? Which is institutional racism is acknowledging that there are policies, practices, procedures that have been created that have benefited white people over people of color, sometimes intentionally and oftentimes unintentionally and inadvertently. And so that has happened. And when we talk about it, it's happened in an institution. Institution, singular, one institution. If we're talking about our education system, or we're talking about our health system, or we're talking about our housing system, in one institution, that's institutional racism, where those policies, practices, procedures have been benefiting white people over communities of color, right? Looking at one institution. Structural racism is acknowledging that it has not just happened in one institution. It has not just happened in some institutions. It has happened in all of our institutions. All of the institutions we've created in government have created policies, practices, procedures that have benefited white people over communities of color. Right? And so that's structural. When you hear the term structural racism, they're talking about it exists across all of government. Right? And so structural is that. Institutional is structural is all. Institutional is one. Individual is that personal, that individual act. Right? And as you see the diagram to the right, you see the spokes to the right, you have them all kind of connected to one another. The acknowledgement is that these things don't operate in silos. They are connected. You have individual people that work in institutions, and you have in those institutions across all of our institutions, right? And the fact that they're all connected to one another is what systemic racism is. When you hear the word systemic racism, it's all of it. Systemic racism is acknowledging individual racism, institutional racism, and structural racism. Right? So from a definitional standpoint, I want to, hopefully that's helping you understand the distinctions. Now, while I've defined it, I also want you to be able to sit with it a little bit. And this is where if we had more time in the training, we would take you on a journey to be able to sit with it. But I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey. This is a short clip that we have with you, right? Which is, I'll encourage you in your own growth to get a chance to see the full clip. But this is a three-part series that was produced by PBS called Race, the Power of Illusion. And in this, we're going to pull a short clip from the third part of the documentary. That third part was called The House We Live In. And so I want to play that clip to really bring into the room a lot of the context of the definition that that I was sharing with you.
It was a time when hundreds of thousands of GIs came home ready to start families, but had no place to live.
In the 1930s, the federal government created the Federal Housing Administration, whose job it was to provide loans or the backing for loans to average Americans so they could purchase a home.
Federal programs and banks sank millions into the home construction industry. Their message to veterans: you can afford a new home. Buy a new home now. Tax dollars help make the single-family home a mass-produced consumer item. The American dream had a new name: suburbia.
came to Levittown and we found the model house, and we walked in and we looked around, and of course, in the eyes of a young man who was raised in the ghetto, so to speak, it was an interesting experience, interesting lifestyle, seeing all the new modern conveniences, very fascinating.
Eugene Burnett came home with almost 1 million other black GIs. They had fought for the country in segregated ranks. They returned hoping for equality and the American dream. For many, that dream was a new home for little money down and some of the easiest credit terms in history.
I went up to the salesman. We're interested in your home. We're interested in buying one. And what is the procedure? Is there an application to be filled out? So forth. So he looked at me, looked around, and he said to me, he says, listen, it's not me, but the owners of this development have not as yet decided to sell these homes to Negroes.
The FHA underwriters warned that the presence of even 1 or 2 non-white families could undermine real estate values in the new suburbs. These government guidelines were widely adopted by private industry. Race had long played a role in local real estate practices. Starting in the 1930s, government officials institutionalized a national appraisal system where race was as much a factor in real estate assessment as the condition of the property. Using this scheme, federal investigators evaluated 239 cities across the country for financial risk.
So that those communities that were all white, suburban, and far away from minority areas, they received the highest rating, and that was the color green. Those communities that were all minority or in the process of changing, they got the lowest rating, and the color red. They were redlined. As a consequence, most of the mortgages went to suburbanizing America, and it suburbanized it racially.
As homes in white communities appreciated in value, the net worth of these white families grew. For most non-white families who stayed in urban neighborhoods, the housing market open to them in the 50s and 60s was largely a rental market. You don't gain equity by paying rent.
Where one's family lives in America is not just a matter of taste and preference. You have the issue of housing and wealth. The majority of Americans hold most of their wealth in the form of home equity. So that's their nest egg. That's how they can finance the education of their offspring. That's how they can sort of save up for retirement. It's their savings bank, right? They're living in their savings bank.
My family, like a lot of families, was in Detroit, struggling to buy a house. You had a dual housing market, one white, one black. A housing market with one with a lot of demand, another housing market with very little demand. My father lives in the house that I grew up in. The house today, 5-bedroom house, is worth about $20,000. The same house bought in the suburbs would be worth today about $320,000. So whites moving to the suburb were being subsidized in the accumulation of wealth, while blacks were being divested.
And these were public policy decisions in which, on one hand, people were given access to property, given title, and subsequently wealth, and on another hand, where people were not given access to property, did not generate wealth, and did not generate the kind of opportunity for the next generation.
So that clip is, like I mentioned, is part of a longer documentary series, again, House We Live In, and I encourage you to have a chance to go through the whole clip. It's about 50 minutes. And the reason why I bring it up in the space that we have here, because it's helpful to see even in that 6 minutes, better context of the definitions I gave of institutional racism and structural racism, right? That there were policies that were put in place that have benefited white people over communities of color. Like, that could be tough to hear. Think about your audience, think about your neighbors, and think about folks in your cities. Like, how many folks do not know that, right? And the policies, practices, procedures that were put in place that have benefited white people over communities of color, right? People don't, that's just a fact. It's just what it was, right? And as we think about the implications of that, is so important, right, in doing this work. The normalizing is important because just sitting with that takes a journey of just normalizing. And this is like a crash course training for you guys. We usually take you on a little bit more of a journey before dropping all of that on for you to process, right? So I'm just acknowledging that. So I'm imagining even as you're sitting with it, there might be even spaces of uncomfortable sitting, even processing the video that we normally would want to debrief and unpack and create some space for that dialogue. But you as city leaders need to be thinking about it in terms of its implications, right? In that normalizing. And so one of the contracts we have, we do work with the city of Denver, and we've been doing now a series of trainings with them. And this was looking at their redlining maps in the city of Denver, right? Where they were in their neighborhoods 80 years ago. But it also looked at what the population looked like closer to present, right? And those same darker areas, and this is the population, same neighborhoods, population in 2016, the same darkened areas where a higher percentage of people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color live. And what they found is a lot of those same neighborhoods where the redlining map is where we still continue to see high percentage of populations of Black, Indigenous people of color. And so the point that Tim Wise made that if you remember his point, like we acted like people ended up where they ended up by accident, it wasn't by accident. Right? Where people live have been intentional policies, whether people got loans to go certain places, and then as a result, the decisions that we make about services and how we then start calculating who gets what services or where grocery stores go or where schools, or you think about your taxes and all the other policies that are associated with these decisions. Now, and when you start to get to those policies, that's where you start inadvertently continuing to reinforce institutional racism or structural racism by not understanding the intentionality of those policies, right? And so I know we've said a whole lot on the normalizing space, and we could go so much more deeper into this space. Trust me, we have a series of trainings where we can dedicate more time in the normalizing, but we would run out of time if I continue going down that road and not create the space of even talking about the operationalizing. So you might be at some point like, Leon, thank you, that helps us. Now I understand some basic understanding of why change is needed. I understand some basic terminology of equity versus equality and understanding bias and understanding levels of racism. So that's a good foundation to be, okay, I understand why change is needed. And so then the question is, what are some solutions? What are some proposed solutions that you can take to then operationalize this in your city, right? And we want to just highlight some of that. And part of the operationalizing space is how are you moving from intent to looking at the impact that you're having in your policies and your practices and your procedures, right? And that's really important in the work you do, right? It's the need to, and so we'll spend hopefully more time operationalizing and organizing for part 2, where we bring in some more local voices and you get a chance to hear how some other cities, even within your state, are operationalizing and organizing. So part 2 will be more in that space. We'll have a little bit more normalizing, but we'll spend more in the operationalizing and organizing. Because it's really important to think about the process of how do you, as you center racial equity, how is it centered in your process within your cities, in your decision-making process? How are you also using tools and products? What are the tools that you can use that is being intentional about how it impacts your process? It's both as you're operationalizing. And it's in the tool space that we want to, for you to think more about your tool as you're thinking about the process, right? And so these components we want to, it's important to really realize are critical in how you would operationalize and center your process, racial equity process. And so as you can see in the design of the tool, right in the middle of that tool is really talking about the importance of community. and how critical it is if you're going to be committed to racial equity work. You can't do it in a bubble as a city. You can't be off on your own thinking like, oh, we'll figure it out, we'll come up with the good decisions, and we're going to show we're committed to racial equity, and you're going to bring it back to the community. It doesn't work that way, right? And so it requires you to center the community, and more explicitly, it requires you to center the voices of Black people, voices of Indigenous people, and the voices of all of your people of color. And what's the work that you need to do to operationalize that as you're centering racial equity in your city? And as you do that, then you start to look at the different components of your process, of looking at are you setting the right goals and the right results for different issues that you're looking at? Or how are you understanding the data and who's being impacted by the data, and helping the community, even in spaces when you're talking about data, not just the quantitative data, but it's the anecdotal, qualitative data of how this impacts people's lives, and what's the work you do to really get at understanding the data. Then you think about strategies, like who's benefiting and who's burdening from these policies that we've put in place, and what can we do differently as we're centering the voices of our community. And then how do you think differently about implementing your process, or even how do you communicate your commitment or holding yourselves accountable? Like, all of these elements are critical. You got to walk it through each of your issues as you're looking at a range of issues. And so I want to just give you a sense of a sample of what those issues are in the work we do with cities. It could across the board. It could be from our contracting policies within your city, policies and procedures, to your local fines and fees structure, to your complaint-based systems that you have, and how you look at center racial equity in that space, to your zoning and permitting. Every city can deal with some aspects of their policies, practices, procedures as you start to center racial equity, thinking about who's benefiting and who's burdening from those policies, and begin to do that from a space that really brings into context the voices, again, of your Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Right, and then as we go even further in this space, what we do in that operationalizing space is, and how then do you start to get to what we call what we're doing more work on our end called root cause analysis. What's the root cause analysis that allows you to be able to get to the deeper whys, that help you to think differently about your policies? And so not walking this through with you, but just understanding part of what we've been doing in our root cause analysis with you is under step one, understanding what racial equity is, right? And that's a really important step before you start doing any kind of understanding your data and starting to conduct the analysis and start to think differently about your solutions and your policies, right? So these are important steps, right, that we want to acknowledge in the work, and obviously want you to walk away knowing that there are models, knowing that there's deeper work that needs to be done, and also knowing that there is no one size fits all. This is a framework that every policy and every strategy, every city, as you go through that process, particularly as you're centering the voices of your community, come up with different results. And so I want to name that as part of the important part of the work. And then I also want to just name in this space also then how do you begin as city leaders to start to get organized? If you are in this space, like I want to be able to begin to lead in this space, what can I do now? We've created a what can you do right now kind of guide. And so want to encourage you to download a what can you do right now guide off of our website, nlc.org/real. These are things you can do right now if you want to lead in this space, and gives examples of what cities are doing. As city leaders, how do you set the example? What does it look like for you to set the example of advancing racial equity within your city? There's space around listening, which is one of the most critical parts of you as a leader in this space. How are you creating spaces to listen and understand the hurt and the harm in your community, and how that informs you, how that informs the decisions you make. But the listening also must be complemented with some kind of declaration. Like if you're going to be committed to this, there's got to be something you're also committing to changing. And so what's those public declarations that you need to make that shows that you're committed to being on this journey? And some of that declaration could be infrastructure that you want to put in place. These are cities of all sizes that, now are thinking about chief equity officers or having an office of racial equity, and then, there are infrastructure decisions that you need to make. Where does this live? And then start to look at how do you commit to certain policies that you can change right now that are inequitable. and even your commitment to creating a racial equity plan. So there are things you could do right now if you wanted to be committed. I encourage you to both kind of download the guide, but also we encourage you on our website. There are a number of examples of cities that we've profiled that are doing this work. You can see Tacoma, Washington being one. I think we have Seattle as well as one of our profiles. So you can see some examples of some of the larger cities in your state and what they're doing. But we also work with a lot of smaller cities, not just within your state, but across the country. St. Louis Park, small in Minnesota, Park Forest, Arlington, Massachusetts, a number of smaller cities. Again, there's not a one-size-fits-all, and also want to be clear that as we're putting up these profiles, what I said at the beginning is also still true. These cities would not say that they have figured out racism, right? They have not ended racism in their cities, right? What it does give you is a sense of some of the common themes of what the work looks like across these cities. It gives you a sense of, kind of the infrastructure, the core teams you want to build. How do you work across your departments? How do you think about kind of the accountability agreements or departmental work plans you want to have, or performance reviews, or how do you want to use your racial equity tools? So it gives you some guidance, right, in terms of how you want to get organized and how do you modify it within your work in your cities. And that's the work we do with cities. That's what we hope, obviously, is as you're looking to do deeper work, that there's opportunities for us to be helpful for you as you're looking to do deeper work within your cities. And so I want to also, as you think about organizing, acknowledge in doing this work that it's really important to think about organizing and the groups into groups, the kinds of groups that you are engaging with in this work. There could be groups within your city council, it could be groups within your city, it could be groups within your community, but it's really important to think about the different types of groups and be very intentional about organizing for each of the groups. And so when I think about the groups, I want to share with you the 4 groups that I feel are fairly consistent in the work that we see in cities across the country. And so that first group is called, they're advocates. You'll have folks within your city, on council, within the community that are advocates. They're willing to be, that might be you, right? You might be the one that is the advocate, right? Willing to be out there talking about these issues, using your platforms, and they exist. There are advocates out there in your community, and there needs to be a plan to organize around those advocates. And so I want to acknowledge that organizing piece is really important to the advocates. The second group are what I would refer to as followers. They're not advocates, but they're willing to follow. They're willing to show up for the meeting. They're willing to be on the Zoom call or the virtual meeting. They're willing to put the sign in the yard, but they're not gonna be out there with a loud voice, right? But they're willing to be followed. They could be active followers. They could be passive followers. But they're your followers. And so, what's your plan to organize around those followers? What's the work that needs to happen with those followers? The third group is the skeptics. These are the ones that could be actively skeptic, they could be positive skeptic, they could be negative skeptic. They just are skeptical. They always got questions. They're not exactly seeing why this is important, and so there's a need to organize around your skeptical group, right? And what's the work that needs to happen with those folks that are skeptical? They're still questioning things. Why are we talking about race? They're in that space, right? And so there's work that you need to organize around your skeptical group. And then your final group are your resistors, right? And there will be resistors in this work. And you have active resistors and you got passive resistors, but they're going to resist. And many times they always will resist. Regardless of what you do, they will always resist. And so you still need a plan for your resistors. And you have to organize with your resistors as well. And so there's work and organizing around each of those. The organizing with the advocates is what can you do to help them be more effective as advocates? What's the work that needs to be done with them to help them be more effective as advocates? For the ones that are followers, is there a plan or strategy you can put in place to help them become advocates? Maybe there's a path for them to maybe start using their voice. And what's the work to help them become maybe more active followers or maybe even advocates for you? For the skeptical group is like, what can we do to give them information? Maybe they might be willing to be followers. And so can you move them from skeptical to followers, right? And so what's the work in our strategy and our plan? And for those of resistors, it's also really important to acknowledge that the work there is not necessarily getting them to become skeptical or getting them to become followers or getting them to become advocates. Is there a strategy to get them to become less resistant? And there is work you can do to make people less resistant. Like, how do you create spaces where you acknowledge people's humanity? Acknowledging humanity, even when people disagree with you, particularly as we talk about issues of race, that can create spaces of just being able to see and hear each other. That can make people less resistant. And there's a strategy we use in place that we train city leaders on in this space of how do you affirm a person's humanity before you counter. Even because it's easy to start countering somebody when you disagree with them. But how do you affirm a person's humanity first, even when you completely disagree with them, right? And so there's work on all the four of those groups I want to name as you're starting to really think about the organizing. And the reason why I name it, because as we think about organizing around this work, it's not just organizing because it's the moral thing to do or it's the right thing to do, right? For many folks, there could be folks in one of those four groups that part of your strategy is helping them to see that focusing on racial equity is good governance, right? By us focusing on racial equity, it's helping our city become more prosperous or healthier or safer or more accountable. That's a different way of engaging with someone around this work. You're not trying to go after their heart, you're appealing to their head, right? And what's the work that you can do to help appeal to their head? And so there's a really good resource that I didn't get a chance to put in. I was going to put in the state of Washington, but you can put in within the state. You can put your state, you can put your city in, depending on, or even a region, and it starts to look at kind of some data. Data makes the business case for racial equity. If you go to nationalequityatlas.org, it's a place where you can go and really play around with that to kind of get a better sense. And so in this case, I was looking at looking what the economy would be if there was no racial gaps in income, right? And that, for me, speaks to someone who's more concerned about bottom line business of our city, right? And how you can really speak to that and what that looks like. And so I really want you to hear the multiple ways of organizing and how to think differently about how you communicate in that space. And so I want to end where I began. I began with a quote. I want to end with a quote. And I want to create some space as well to see if there's any questions that you have for me. But I started with the late Dr. Maya Angelou. I want to end with Angela Davis. That if you're walking away feeling like there's more you need to do in this space and are committed to advancing racial equity, that you're committed to no longer accepting the things you cannot change, but you're committed to changing the things you no longer can accept. And I hope that's the mantra that drives your commitment to this work as city leaders in that space. Also want to leave my contact information if you want to reach out to us, our website that you can reach out to us. Acknowledge, I think that there might be questions about, will we share the slides? Absolutely, we'll send you the slides for you guys to be able to have copies of the slides, so we'll get that out to you. We also will send you links to the videos because the videos are embedded in the slides, so they'll be too large. So what we'll do is send you separate links to those videos if you want to be able to see the videos for yourself. But let me pause. I'm stop sharing my screen here for a moment and use this as an opportunity for everyone, for those that are on camera, we can see each other, and see if there are any questions for me. There's a lot in the chat, so I'm not sure about if there are questions in that chat, but I can start opening some of those up too, just to see if there's anything there that I could be helpful.
Leon, early on in the chat, there was a question about where people can find resources about redlining in their community. How would you recommend that people dig into that work?
Great question. So it varies by city. Obviously some of your planning departments can get access to the redlining maps. You've heard that there are almost 240 different redlining maps across the country. There's a website. I'll also send that to you as a follow-up where you can access those maps. University of Richmond has a website where we go to download the maps. But there's a lot more deeper work you can do in that space. We have as we do some work with cities, we work with cities sometimes to create these redlining exhibits. We have a partner that can create kind of an exhibit to help you that can be available for the community. Obviously, we're in a physical distancing side, so the exhibit is probably not the best strategy right now, given how many of us are still physically distancing. But the exhibit has been another effective way to kind of educate and share. And then we also have folks that, cities that are very good at bringing in a lot of local faculty. If you're a faculty, if you have a university or a faculty person that does some of this research and can give some of the local context, that's another way that we've seen cities go deeper in the redlining and getting access to more context around redlining. And then also, again, centering the voices of the community. We've also seen cities that are very intentional about bringing voices from the community, really talking about the impact of redlining in their lives, right? And so some people can really remember those stories about where they could live and where they couldn't live. And just hearing those stories also bring to life the power of your redlining maps. And also acknowledging if you were in a city that didn't have redlining, there were also cities that dealt with racial covenants. We didn't go into racial covenants, which is another aspect of the same kind of consistent policy. So there are lots of dynamics unpacked there, but hopefully it gives you different strategies or different places you could go if you're looking to go deeper.
Hey, Leon, my name is Kent. I got a question for you. Very much enjoyed the presentation. I came in a little late, but I enjoyed what I heard. I'm interested in your strategy or maybe some advice on how to do this approach. One of the things that I struggle with is the let's study this, let's look at it, let's talk about it, let's get together focus groups to look at all this. And I get it. I mean, you got to do that. But realistically, we've been doing that for a long time. I mean, 30, 40 years. And we've got enough data that we know certain things like redlining and other things don't work. And so my interest is in one category that you said, there are things that we could do now. And I'm really interested in not studying stuff, but say, hey, we've studied these last 40 years and we know we got the data, we know that this is how it impacts, and really just picking it up and just doing it. And so what I'm struggling with is whenever we talk about this topic, people want to study it, they want to get together with people, they want to talk about stuff, and then guys on the vine, the next generation, they do it all over again. And so my strategy is, like, we know what we got to do. Let's just do it. Can you talk about that and what that strategy and all that kind of stuff?
You know, thank you for that question, Kent, and just obviously naming the importance to move to action. And I agree with if you're committed as a city, particularly if you are in how this is seen by the community, you have to be able to show that you're not just going to go through another space of we're going to talk about it. Because there is a lot of harm that you do in that space if you're just creating spaces for talking. Healing is needed, so I want to acknowledge that to do this work, we do talk a lot about racial healing in this work. I did spend a lot of time in this space naming that in our space. The racial healing is important, and cities need to be a part of that. That racial healing is acknowledging that there is harm that government has done to Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color. And we as a government, if you're committed as a leader, recognize that history, recognizing that it currently is having an impact in your community, and healing, you need to be willing to acknowledge that as a government. And then also you have to be, as part of your healing, committed to making public commitments to structural changes. Like we have to, as a city, you have to be communicating that out to your community, that you both are important. We need to heal, we need to acknowledge, but we also need to create structural change. So I think from an action standpoint, just that alone sends a different message of what are you declaring to your community, that we recognize this, we recognize the role we've played, we recognize the harm we've had, and we've also are committing to the kind of structural change. And the structural change requires us to engage and center your voices, center the voices of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in this process, and then building a process that's centering their voices in it, right? You can't come to the table saying, oh, we are gonna make these changes and don't know the impact that those changes are actually having on Black, Indigenous, people of color. So you have to do the work to understand what impact it's having. But at the same time, I think the point that Kent is bringing up, there are some obvious low-hanging fruit. You know, and I mentioned in that checklist in the operation, I went through it quickly, but if you look at your contracting policy, if you look at your zoning policies, if you look at your fines and fees, there are things you can do that you know that we know from the work that there are clear inequities. And there are clear messages you can send where you acknowledge some low-hanging fruit that we know we need to change as a city, while also committing to the larger structural change work that needs to happen. So being able to recognize that's how you show yourself authentic in the space as you're engaging the community, by acknowledging those things that you can change right now as you look at, as you think about where the inequities are, but realizing that alone is not enough. You can't check the box and say, oh, we did it, we solved it, and we don't have any more work to do. But there's still a balance that you need to strike between both.
Thank you, Leon. Councilmember Gerald Lee Anderson had a question.
Hi, Leon. Thank you so much for the great presentation. I'm really interested in your thoughts on this question, which is, would you say that the issue from a policymaker's perspective is the absence of policy, or bad policies, or something else?
Oh, that's a never a one size fits all, right? So, you know, there's obviously bad policy that's been in place as you think about policies that have been out there. I gave you an example about the street level drug arrest one. There are policies like that all the time. There's absence of good policy as well in that space. You know, what are some what are policies that would be better to be put in place? So I wouldn't. What was your third one? Good, bad policy.
Something else.
Or something else. I don't know what that something else is, but I would like to keep that option open.
Maybe budget or something. I mean, is it money? Is it rules, or both, or something?
Yeah, well, but part of me feels like it's still, some of it might still be connected to policy, which is why when you say something else, I feel like there is policies, practices, procedures that you as city leaders impact and influence. It impacted in your budgets of how you're targeting resources, how you think differently about policy that is being more targeted. I think that's going to be that's the hardest part of the work with city leaders, is if you know, the data is one part. I mean, yes, you know, there was a question that I think Kent asked earlier, like, yeah, we know some of the data, but we also realize for a lot of cities, you actually don't. You actually are not collecting and disaggregating data by race and ethnicity. And so you got to do some of that data assessment. We know anecdotally, we know what the data probably will show, that there are some potential patterns of disparities when you look at your use of force, or when you look at your services, your municipal fees, your bonds. I mean, we'll show what we already know from the data, that race is still the strongest predictor of one's success in this country, but you got to get the data to be able to show that as you are then targeting that, then figure out what your targeted strategies are. And the data is one part, and that's work you need to do. And I agree with the point, you don't want to get so caught up in the data where you're not doing, because people then use like, oh, we don't have the data, and you do nothing. Right, and then that's like analysis paralysis. It's kind of like, yeah, it's a good way of, if you want to be a resistor, like you just use that as a strategy. Like, oh, we don't have the data yet, so let's get the data first before we do it. That's a good tactic, right, to use, right? But in addition to the data, once you have the data, is then what can you do to then be targeted? And as city leaders, that's the tough decisions you have to make, right? Because if you know where the need is, then how are we developing targeted strategies? Right? And that requires political leadership. That requires you making the case why you're being targeted, because it has a larger benefit for what you want to achieve for your city. Closing the gaps, again, where race is no longer predicting one's success in our city while improving outcomes for everyone, right? And so you have to be able to be committed to that targeted work, and how that shows up with existing policy or new policy or something else is all part of the journey that you got to be committed to being a part of.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Councilman member Betsy Wilkerson from Spokane had a question.
Got me? Yes, so can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. So a couple of things. First of all, thanks for the presentation this morning. And I want to make a comment that I don't think a lot of our majority population hears on racism on the individual level. They sometimes get defensive that it's all white folks that have to do the work, but I want to acknowledge to them that Black folks and other folks still have their issues that we are working through also. So it doesn't always seem like the us versus kind of them. And on the 6 steps, I have found the challenge is dedicated infrastructure. That's what I'm seeing right now in this space in government, is that, you know, a lot of volunteers, advocates, because it is heavy work, and government hasn't dedicated the support and staffing to that. And talk to me about creating a space to listen in government. What would that look like, please?
Yeah, thank you for those comments and for naming kind of when we say journey. I appreciate you naming as well that journey is everyone. Everyone is on the journey as we're trying to advance racial equity. This is not just white people. It's not just Black people. We're talking about our indigenous and our people of color. It's everyone on that journey. Everyone has different starting points in this journey and how they show up. And no one really, I don't know anyone that loves talking about this. I'm in front of you. I had to get over a lot of myself to want to talk about these issues of race. No one, as a person of color, not like I want to talk about this. No one wants to talk about it. But if our inability not to be on that journey, we know all we will do is just continue to exacerbate. As that Maya Angelou quote, the reason why I love Maya Angelou's quote is our inability to do it is that, you know, we'll find ourselves coming back to this problem, you know, 5, 10, 50 years from now. So I appreciate you naming that in the space. And also acknowledging the importance of infrastructure. I think infrastructure is super critical, and we're finding now a growing amount of cities of all sizes that are committed to it, knowing that they need to put some dollars into their budget for infrastructure. It has to be a part of how we do business. And I'm happy to talk more about the different models that we're seeing. And I'm actually encourage you to go to our website. We actually have a repository of policies of what cities are creating, and on the web, one of the link is kind of the different examples of different infrastructure cities are creating in their cities. So if you want to get a sense of the different examples of infrastructure, that's a good space to check out. Now the listening piece that you asked is a really important piece. We name it particularly as city leaders, how you show up, particularly in what we call trauma-informed communities, and in communities that have been trauma and traumatized for decades. How are you creating spaces to listen? And listening is being very mindful that these can be very, very difficult, uncomfortable conversations. And listening, you have to be willing to lean into the uncomfortable spaces, because what's important as you're listening is not to set the parameters of what's appropriate for listening, what's appropriate behavior, right? You have to create the space, recognizing people are bringing their hurt and their harm, and there will be several times you got to say to yourself, ouch, and you got to keep the ouch to yourself, right? Because you have to allow for that space, to allow for people to be able to bring that hurt in space. But that listening has to be connected to you listening for a purpose of action. If the community feels like you're just listening and do no action, then you're actually causing more hurt. And so you have to be willing to listen and also commit to the kind of structural changes that are tied to where that hurt is being expressed through the spaces you're creating for listening. So it's an active listening. It's a listening that can be very challenging, but it's super critical if you're going to be committed to doing this work with your community.
I have to comment, I was in another training last week and we were talking about this in this group of leaders in Spokane, and we were having this trusted space. But the first thing they said is, what we say in here doesn't leave this space, because they didn't want to be judged about their perspectives on these issues outside of that room. So they want to talk about it, but they're still very cautious in how they lead and lean into it. That was just something different for me, because we're so out there about it most of the time.
No, thank you for that. But I actually do feel like when we do trainings, more in-depth trainings, we normally start with a learning environment and certain kind of environments that we think are important to have. And we do say what stays here what is said here stays here. That's one of our phrases. What is said here stays here, as a way of creating safe spaces, because you do need to set an environment for people to learn. But what is learned here should leave here. So if you learn something, to be able to share that with somebody else, right? So setting that environment is really super critical.
Thank you. Before I call on the next person to ask a question, I'm going to ask everybody to mute yourself if you're not actively one of the people who is asking a question. And with that, I will turn it over to Commissioner Kate Dean to ask her question.
Hi, Leon. Thanks for a great presentation. And I really appreciate the Councilwoman's question previously, and this builds on that a little bit. You know, I think we have not done a great job of electing BIPOC folks in this state. Generally, we don't have enough leadership of people of color, and so we have a lot of white leadership, myself included, who are trying to tackle this issue and wrestling with the responsibility of doing this important work and owning it as majority population and highly privileged, empowered people. And then not trying to figure out how to work with our BIPOC community in a way that centers on their issues, but also doesn't kind of dominate and take over. So it's like trying to navigate that role of leadership and ownership and responsibility, but then that so easily falls into the same old models then of centering on our issues, which, you know, could be our guilt or and then also not wanting to kind of exhaust a community which is grieving, traumatized, exhausted, tired of helping their white friends figure all this out. So kind of more to the idea of listening and community engagement, which you mentioned, and maybe I'm jumping to the tools too quickly, but any thoughts on kind of how you strike the balance there of working with your BIPOC community without it being in the same old model of kind of extracting value from them?
Yeah, no, good question, and I appreciate you naming the challenge, the challenges. I think it's important to know in doing this work, we all will make mistakes on this journey. You know, there's no perfect pathway to figuring it out, because everyone is bringing perspectives, and you got to be willing to be comfortable. And this is hard for all of us as people, to be called out when you've done something wrong. And you got to be willing to sit with that. And that's a space where it gets uncomfortable. You got to lean into that space of uncomfortable, because we want to know if we just do these things, then it's going to be right. And it's messy in this space to do this work, because the history is messy of our country, of how we've not navigated through race effectively. So I want to just name that, and I wish I could provide any more comfort in it sounding sounding nicer, but it's also part of that work. But within that space, what gives me hope is that so many more people are willing to lean into that space. And part of leaning in is what work are each of us doing to grow individually, right? It's not coming into space looking for answers. There's a lot of journeys that folks are doing their own readings now. That's the growth of, whether it's the White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, or Tim Wise' White Like Me, or New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, or How to Be Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. Like, there's a lot of folks that are picking up books and reading or looking at documentaries like The House We Live In or 13th or all these other, and folks are doing that work on their own. And I say folks, be more explicit, white people are doing that work on their own. Like that for me is a sign of hope of there being a space like people. Part of having white privilege is not having the choice to do that. You're making the choice, because the privilege has existed for you to benefit from. And so you can choose to allow that privilege to continue to be what it is and not try to take any action. And so what's happening is, whether the pressure, and whether it's because of COVID-19 or everyone's in their homes or whatever the dynamic is, there are more folks paying attention, more folks in general, and you're definitely seeing a larger percentage of white people paying attention in that space. And I also want to acknowledge, even before COVID, what I've also seen in the last 6 years is more spaces where you're finding white people are finding white allies in this space and strengthening their voices. There's a huge network out there if you're of white people coming together through showing up for racial justice. It's called SURGE. I'm not sure if they have chapters in Washington across your state or not, but that's been happening for 5+ years, I believe now, right? And part of that's white people coming together to talk about race to each other, right? And the work that needs to happen in that space, because that's one of our consultants that we work with, former mayor from Minneapolis, Betsy Hodges. So she's a mayor that I work a lot with some of our trainings. And so she says this, she's very good about talking about whiteness. She creates a space to sit and talk about it, uncomfortable, but does it in such an effective and powerful way. But she's very clear that white people need to know how to talk to other white people about race. We don't need people of color or black people or indigenous people. You need to create the spaces to be able to do that. And that's a choice you're making, right? And places like showing up for racial justice allows you to be able to make those choices, right? And I think part of what has explained the growth in the last 6 years with the response to the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor is that white people are much more present than they were 6 years ago after Michael Brown. And as they're showing up as allies. And as allies, they've done their space of understanding what it means to be an ally. I don't need to be out front. I could be a leader, I could be a mayor, I could be a council member, but what does it mean to lead from my space of where I can influence? And what does it mean just to show up and to be an ally in that space? So there's a lot of those growth areas that I think is also part of that work, while also recognizing if you're going to do the work in city government, you still got to be committed to creating the spaces where you're centering the voices of your Black, Indigenous, people of color. Like that's got to be still at the center of your commitment that is critical to laying that foundation. So I know I'm saying a whole lot of pieces. Hopefully that's giving you some pieces to kind of sit with and digest.
Thank you very much.
I don't see any remaining questions at this point with people's hands raised. We did say that we would end around 11:30. We're a little bit over that. This has been a great discussion. I would just take, if there is one last question from the group before we end the training, we can do that. It looks like Councilmember Yolanda Trout, Manuel has a question.
It's not a question, it's just a statement. Thank you, Leon, for bringing this topic to us and the slides and everything. I've taken this training in National Leagues of Cities and I've learned a lot. And I was there in National Leagues when Clarence had that panel, and I saw in the audience that it made a lot of people very uncomfortable. And even within our own city, last year, the mayor approached me because I was the first Latina person of color to have been elected on the council. And the mayor approached me and asked me if I would bring this, take the lead on bringing this to our council. And I did, and it was a little challenging because we had a couple of council members that didn't feel that we needed this training. And at the end, we ended up passing it, and we were supposed to start it in January. But because of the COVID and everything, has slowed down everything, and we're going to have our first meeting next week. So our staff has already been getting the training, and then the council will start getting our training on the 28th, I believe. So I'm really looking forward to using these tools and to see what our city is going to do forward with this. So thank you again for bringing this to us.
Yeah, my pleasure. And what city? What city? I missed it. You told me what city you're from.
I'm from the city of Auburn, Washington, South King County.
Great, that's awesome.
Great. Well, with that, we will go ahead and wrap up today's session. Do remember that this is a two-part series, so we hope everybody will join in on September 16. You will be hearing from us after today's session in the next day or two with links to the resources and also the PowerPoint. So I just want to thank everyone for participating on today's session training. Thank you very much, Leon. We really appreciate our partnership with NLC and what you've been able to bring to our state. And then just a final reminder for the members of the AWC Equity Work Group, the 14 of you, please stay on the session.
Thank
So
you.
thank you. Bye-bye.